All right, good afternoon. My name is Charles Jennings. I'm director of the Christian Regenhard Center for Emergency Response Studies here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York. The Christian Regenhard Center was formed in 2008 with a earmark from then U.S. New York Senator Clinton, and we are still the only cross-discipline applied policy research center in the United States that looks at issues of emergency response and coordination of services between uniformed agencies and others. And so as part of that work, in addition to research, we also undertake this seminar series, and we're very proud and pleased today to have assembled a great panel in conjunction with our co-sponsors, the International Association of EMS Chiefs. And that panel will be moderated by Paul Maniscalco, who's a President Emeritus of that organization, also a very active EMS and emergency management consultant, and proudly that he's a member of our National Advisory Board as well. So without further delay, I just wanted to let you know, Paul, Oren just joined us and he's online.
Outstanding.
And, I'll turn it over to you from here to get the ball rolling.
Happy EMS week, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Paul Maniscalco. I'm a retired deputy chief and paramedic from FDNY. I'm also a board member of the Racers Institute, proudly from the beginning, and I currently serve as the national director of emergency management for Medxcel, supporting Ascension Health. So a whole nother webinar is going to be careers after EMS and the transportable skills that you can use. I'm real happy to introduce our board members for today for the panel. Dr. Brian Maguire, a great friend, longtime partner on an EMS, and probably the foremost researcher on the types of violence focused on EMS and healthcare workers in the world. And I'm really proud to have him on board. Another longtime friend, Dan Gerard, who's now EMS coordinator for Alameda County and the president-elect of the International Association of EMS Chiefs, will be joining us. Oren Barzilay, who's the president of Local 2507, one of the largest EMS unions in the world, and out of New York City, is joining us to give us some local perspective. We've seen the media reports and the just tragedies that Oren and the members back home are having to deal with violence focused at them. Next, we have Scott Cormier, a former paramedic and paramedic officer out of the Pittsburgh EMS system. And Scott, we proudly work together now. He's the vice president of emergency management, environment of care and safety for Medxcel. And lastly, no panel discussion is really complete without having an attorney. I'll pay him $1 for my retainer fee on this. Lawrence Tan is the former chief paramedic for Newcastle County, Delaware. He's also does instructional work with NDPC and the Department of Homeland Security on some of these issues. He's also an attorney, so he brings a legal perspective and how EMS is dealing with this on policy matters. So without much further ado, I'd like to turn this over to each of the panel members to do a quick introduction for a little more deeper dive on each of them. So Brian, you're up.
Great, thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to work with you back from our early days being lieutenants in New York City EMS when we were teaching a whole bunch of radical new courses. Our profession has evolved quite a bit since then. As Paul mentioned, I do a lot of research in this area. It's been a passion of mine for many years. I'm currently an epidemiologist, senior epidemiologist at a military medical research laboratory in Connecticut. I work for Leidos in that position. I am formerly a university professor, so I spent some time in academia as both a research center director and a graduate program director, as well as being a professor. And prior to that, I was pleased to spend a couple of decades in the New York City EMS system, part of that as part of New York City EMS at the time, and in other roles in the system. So it's a great pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Brian. And you know what they say, the scariest thing for an EMS system is a graduate or a doctoral educated paramedic rising through the ranks. So thanks for everything you do. The next we'd like to introduce real quick is Dan Gerard. Can you introduce yourself to everybody?
Hi, my name is Dan Gerard. I'm a paramedic. I'm currently the EMS coordinator for the city of Alameda. Prior to that, I was the acting EMS director for the city of Oakland. 20 years experience in Newark, New Jersey as an EMT and paramedic. Did some work at GW. I followed after Brian there. Thank you very much, Brian, for moving up and on and creating a position for me. I did a little work in Hong Kong, worked for the Pan American Health Organization for a little bit, and I have a passion for the profession. And I hope to make a good contribution to today's discussion.
Thanks, Dan. And next, I'd like to introduce President Barzilay, who is knee-deep in this on a daily basis, defending his members and trying to create a safe environment. So thanks for taking the time, Oren.
Thank you for bringing me on. It's an honor, it's a pleasure. I worked with some of you for quite some time. This challenges that we face, I'm sure it's all across the country. It's not just in my city, but just to start off, my name is Oren Barzilay. I am the president of the FDNY EMS, representing over 4,000 EMTs and paramedics. I've been doing this for nearly 30 years. As I stated earlier, I've had the pleasure of working under Paul while he was the chief of EMS. I'm currently working with Brian. I've met Larry a few times in person, I think. And I think Dan, Gerard, I've also met you at one of those conferences. So again, it's an honor being here and looking forward to having this discussion with this great panel.
Thanks, Oren. And remember, at this point in our careers, we count our time as the number of refreshers we've had to do.
Yes.
That's where we start ticking the boxes. Next, Absolutely. I'd like to introduce Chief Larry Tan, please, if you have a moment.
Thanks, Paul. My name is Larry Tan. I'm retired Chief of Emergency Medical Services for Newcastle County, Delaware. Retired after 37 years service. Also a licensed attorney in both Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the U.S. District Court of New Jersey, and the United States Supreme Court. I'm currently serving as a national safety officer with Medxcel, which is the largest healthcare facility management company in the United States. And it's certainly a pleasure to be back to my roots within EMS and to be with this group.
And last but not least, we'd like to introduce Chief Scott Cormier. Scott, please.
Hey, thank you, Paul. As Paul said, I got my EMS career started in Pennsylvania, first volunteering in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, and then working for the city of Pittsburgh under Dr. Ron Stewart and Dr. Paul Paris, and was a founding member of the city of Pittsburgh River Rescue Team. You know, I feel that EMS professionals that get involved in healthcare get this synergy and get an understanding of what community healthcare is all about. And so now working on the healthcare side of things, we advocate that EMS and hospitals and other healthcare institutions like family practice physicians and groups work together, not to get the job done that day, but to improve the health of our communities. Thanks, Paul.
Because we've got positions, you can become a REMO with us. I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Brian Maguire. And the last point we'll leave is that before we got active, we've tracked in the last month more than 150 stories anecdotally of assaults against EMS individuals. Those are just the ones that are reported worldwide. And Brian's going to help us bring science, context, and definition to this problem by the great work he's doing. So we'll turn the microphone to Brian.
Great, thank you, Paul. And just a second here as we do the share screen. So what are you seeing now?
We've got your screen. It's in the, there we go. We got this presentation.
Okay, good. So thanks, Paul. So we'll be talking about some of this in context, both from a U.S. perspective and internationally. So as you can see, I have a few different associations there, including being a senior Fulbright scholar in 2009. And during that experience, I was in Australia for 5 months. And one of the poignant moments in Australia was meeting one of the EMS chiefs in a part of Queensland that was probably the size of Texas. And he was the chief for that whole area. And he talked about how about a month before that, one of the EMS personnel in that district had been assaulted. And he talked passionately about not only the outcome of that was not only the injury, but that people across his whole district were psychologically devastated by that experience. So although a lot of the numbers that we have are simply numbers, we have to go over them to get a good understanding of what the scope of the problem. But we also have to keep in the back of our minds, it goes beyond the numbers. There are many, many factors associated with this significant problem. So I have no conflicts of interest and the views of my own. We'll talk about a few different components leading up to where we go from here. So talk about homicides, non-fatal injury rates, perpetrators and weapons, the risks for female medics, and prevention insights, and then my thoughts on how we move ahead. So to put this in context in terms of the homicides, we have to first get a sense of, well, how do EMS people die? And what's the risk of EMS people dying? So this was a study that I did that was published in Annals of Emergency Medicine. And in that study, we found that the fatality rate, the overall fatality rate for EMS personnel was much higher than the national average and comparable to the rates for other emergency services personnel. So this was the first time it was ever quantified. What is the risk of fatality, occupational fatality, on-the-job fatality for EMS personnel? And here we see, this was the first time we saw that our risks of fatality are very similar to other emergency services personnel. When we look just at homicides, though, we see a different picture. Not surprisingly, police officers are at a much higher risk of homicide. It's a tragedy. And here we see some absolute numbers in terms of how their risks compared to the national average of 0.8 and to the EMS average of 1.1. So we also see that the EMS average, the rate of homicides for EMS is well above the national average and way above fire and healthcare personnel, far above healthcare personnel. So that puts the risk of homicide in perspective. So we have a significant problem, and this is just numbers in the US. When we looked at non-fatal injuries, we have a whole bunch of papers. So there's about 10 papers that I've done that touch on assaults. And we won't be going into detail on all of them, but each of them show a different piece of the picture. And hopefully together, as this comes together, we'll get a better overview of what the problem is. So when we look at injuries in general for EMS personnel, we see that the rate of injuries, so if we count for every 100 EMS people, what their rate of injury compared to every 100 firefighters, every 100 police officers, every 100 health service personnel, we can see that the rate for EMS is about 6 times higher than the national average and well above the rate of non-fatal injury for fire, police, and health services. So that puts the kind of the overall perspective, overall risk of injury into perspective. When we look just at violence-related non-fatal injury rates, we're about 30 times higher than the national average for non-fatal injury rates. So a huge risk compared to the national average. So these are a recent study that we published in the American Journal of Public Health. And a couple of things that we get from this. The numbers bounce around a fair bit year to year, but we see there are about 400 serious injuries from assault among EMS personnel in the United States every year. So it's a big problem. In Australia, it's a study I published in Public Health Research and Practice in Australia. Here we see what might be a trend. It's, again, the numbers are a little, they jump around a bit, but there certainly seems to be an increase in the numbers. Certainly from the first year, 2002, to the last year that we had data, 2014, there was about a threefold difference in the number of serious cases against the ambulance personnel in Australia. Also, a recent study from Asia found that about 50% of the people in their study, EMS people, had been victims of assault. And a recent study in London found that the rate, the number of cases of assault against London paramedics in London was rising dramatically. So we're seeing these indications from many places around the world. Now, this is an important perspective as we start working our way towards what do we do about this. We get a better understanding of, well, who are the perpetrators? And an author, Phillips, did a nice overview that I think is very helpful for us as we think about the risks for our personnel. And Phillips talked about 4 types of perpetrators. The first one, no association with the workplace or employees. So this is typically criminal intent. So everybody knows EMS people have no money, so nobody's trying to rob any EMS people. But what we do hear of are times that the personnel are, that their drugs, that they're, the robber is looking for their drugs. Type 2 perpetrators are a customer or patient family member, friend of the patient that's there on the scene. And so we get lots of these individuals as perpetrators of assault against EMS personnel. Type 3 perpetrator, a current or former employee of the workplace. And for us, my look at this is broaden it a little bit to any type of coworker. So a coworker could be EMS coworker, could be somebody who works in the hospital, other emergency services personnel. So coworkers in general, former or present. And fourth, type 4 is the perpetrator had a personal relationship with the employee. And in all my years in EMS, I didn't see a lot of this, but when I was doing the fatality study, I was surprised to find, as I was going through all the case reports for that study, that there were 3 cases in those studies where the EMS person was at the station and a former lover came to the station and killed him. So this is a real issue for EMS. So why it's important that that we understand and that we think about, we have this kind of structure as we approach the topic, is that we can easily see, as we describe these different perpetrators, that if we're trying to think about what kind of mitigation strategies we can come up with, that they would differ by perpetrator. So what do we know about specifically about perpetrators against EMS personnel? So we did a study from the AJPH study in the United States. 77% of the perpetrators were patients and 8% were coworkers. So so that's a big number of coworkers who And by the way, these are not minor injuries. These are pretty significant injuries for a person to make it into this database. If there's a cut or a scratch, they don't show up in this. So this is it's a big deal to show up in this database. Same thing internationally. So when we did the survey, international survey, we found that 90% of the perpetrators were patients and 5% were patient family members. We asked about weapons in our international survey. We had respondents from 13 countries for that study. And those respondents, people who had been assaulted, said that in 10% of the assault cases, the perpetrator used a weapon. So it's important for us to understand what those types of risks are. We don't have those data for the United States. We need to, for future studies, be able to identify that. Another really surprising thing that first came up in a fatality study, that the indication was that, that females had a higher risk than males. And this was unexpected. And why it's unexpected and why it's important is that if it's true, and by the way, we still don't have enough data to really show this conclusively, but all the indications are so far that this is the case. But why it's important is A, we should be doing a better job protecting our female personnel. B, we expect in the back of our minds that these cases of assault against EMS people are completely random. But if there's a difference in risk by sex, then it's not completely random. And if it's not completely random, then we might have some opportunities for prevention. And third is that the presence of differences indicates the need for interventions that are specific. So when we go forward and talk about how we solve this, the perpetrator topic and the sex difference topics, and more that we'll talk about momentarily, are indicating that there's not going to be a one size fits all. If we had the data, we'd also probably almost certainly find that there's differences in risks by age group and maybe by experience level. So maybe young, inexperienced EMS personnel have a very different type of risk than people who have been around longer and who are more mature. So all of these are starting to paint the pictures of what the different components of this issue that we need to understand before we can have a solid foundation for reducing those risks. So in an attempt to look at this from different perspectives, we did a survey of an international survey of people who were EMS people who were assaulted. And we got responses from 655 paramedics, EMS personnel, who had been the victims of assault. A third of them almost indicated that they believed that the incident could have been prevented. So that's a big proportion. So these are not things that people are just walking into and there's nothing we could have done about it and boom, I was completely helpless. No, a third of the people said, there's something that could have been done that could have prevented this. The assaulted medics noted that training is needed in self-defense, de-escalation techniques, and for improving situational awareness. Another very interesting thing from the 655 people did a lot of writing about the incident, what they thought about it, what they thought could have been done to prevent it. Not one of them said having a gun or a bulletproof vest would have helped me. So I think that's an important consideration too for us when we think about where we go, what needs to be done. And here's another interesting thing about the topic. So we did a literature review, looked at every paper that possibly had any relationship to this topic. And one of the major findings was that there's not one study of an intervention. So in all these cases and all these problems, all these around the world, nobody has written about what they've done to prevent this. We're not alone, so we shouldn't think completely that EMS is way behind the curve here. We did a Cochrane review looking at healthcare in general, and we found there's not a lot of good research on interventions to reduce healthcare workers, assaults against healthcare workers either. So what can we do? And I'm going to talk about this real briefly on a couple of levels. And the first is a personal approach. So a lot of the people who had been assaulted said that they should have had better situational awareness, that they got so focused on taking care of the patient that they didn't see that the patient was reaching for a weapon. They didn't see the distraught person behind them, that they should have had better situational awareness. From a personal approach, I think we can do better pre-tour planning. So I'm a pilot, and I can tell you before every flight, every pilot says out loud, the last thing before we throttle up and take off, the last thing we do on the ground before we do that is we say, all right, if we have an engine failure here, this is what we're going to do. If we have an engine failure here, this is what we're going to do. And pilots who are flying by themselves say that out loud. So I think the lesson that we can learn from that is that we can do pre-tour planning, and we can talk to our partner and say, if either of us feels the slightest threat, let's agree that we have a code. And I think a good code, we don't want to do danger, danger, Will Robinson, or red alert. No, what we want to do is something that's not going to make the situation worse. We can say something along the lines of, can you give me a hand with the blue bag? And everybody knows that once you say that, everything stops. Drop everything and get out. Leave the equipment behind. The equipment can be replaced. You cannot be replaced. So I think we can do more along those lines to protect ourselves and our coworkers. And attend self-defense class periodically. This is very important. A few months after I became a paramedic, I became a black belt in Taekwondo. And for me personally, that I think was very helpful during my many years on ambulances in New York City. But I am not advocating that every paramedic should become a black belt. What I am advocating is that taking that control for yourself, having that ability to do something if you or your partner are being attacked makes a huge difference. And it's not a one-shot thing. You can't just go take an hour class at some point and think you're done. You need to have an ongoing, you need to do it periodically. So I'd encourage everybody to, from a personal perspective, to do those things. So from an agency level, moving up, EMS people are really good at independent actions, but we're not so good at, or we could be better in terms of team approaches. And this is a classic problem that is not solved by an individual. There's no supervisor, manager, president is going to just say, here's a new rule, follow this and you're fine. It's not going to work that way. It hasn't been solved that way. It won't be solved that way. It needs a team approach, and it needs funding. You know, years ago, a university could put in a grant and get money and do projects like this. It doesn't happen that way anymore. To get money to do this type of research is almost impossible unless you have agencies that are also contributing to the project. And I know EMS agencies don't have two dimes to rub together, I know, but it's not something that necessarily that one agency has to take on for themselves. It's something that, if a bunch of agencies work together, they could potentially fund a research project. So the team needs to work together, develop, implement, and evaluate risk reduction interventions, develop and share evidence-based best practices, and publish their results. So we think about this, there are over 20,000 EMS agencies in the United States alone. And likely every one of those agencies has implemented some kind of violence prevention program. But nobody has written about it. And so we as a profession, again and again and again, are left to reinvent the wheel and go down the same pathways that led to no real change, when instead, what we need to do is to share our experiences so that the next person, the next agency, isn't doing the same exact thing with the same outcomes. So how that looks, assemble a team, identify the problem, identify contributing factors. So we've talked about a bunch of contributing factors. So there may be differences by sex, by age, maybe by time of day. One of the studies we did showed pretty dramatic differences by time of day, maybe by call type. So maybe there's differences by call type. So these are the types of things that we should be thinking about when we think about, well, how are we going to address this problem that we've identified? And then we identify and develop and test interventions and evaluate outcomes. So did it work? Did it have the outcome that we wanted? And what are the outcomes that we want? So there's lots of things that we can consider, but one of the things is, how many assaults did we have in the year after the intervention that we did in the years prior to the intervention? So we have to have good things specific things that we can evaluate. And sometimes, we make a little loop there. So we evaluate outcomes and say, oh, we got to work a little on that intervention, make a little change, develop and test, and do that until we're comfortable with that. And then implement those changes on a large scale and publish the findings so that everybody knows what's been done, what works, and what doesn't work. So in ending, to take a broader picture here, and to put this kind of in context. So I think the future of EMS is we no longer have to wait for the emergency to happen, that we can prevent them. So this today is taking one piece of the prevention puzzle and focusing it on EMS personnel. But there's a lot of prevention stuff that EMS people, EMS professionals can do. We have that capability. We no longer have to take every patient in the hospital. More and more around the world, EMS personnel are treating people at home and either leaving them at home or taking them to alternate care sites. We don't have to take everyone to the hospital. We no longer have to expect many paramedics to be killed and injured. We can absolutely reduce those injuries overall, crash injuries, all those injuries and fatalities. We no longer have to expect to be incapacitated in a short career. We can have a long, healthy career. One of the things that first amazed me when I went to Australia was the number of gray-haired paramedics there were. My experience, you saw very few gray-haired paramedics. You see very few gray-haired paramedics in the United States, but there's a lot of gray-haired paramedics in Australia because they have a long, healthy career. They're well paid, they are well taken care of, and they stick around. And that's a reasonable expectation when you enter a career, that it should be a long and healthy career. And finally, that we should no longer fear to be assaulted on duty. I think there's a lot that we can and should be doing to prevent that. And finally, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has. Thanks very much. Look forward to talking with you more about any of these things during our discussion session.
Thanks, Brian, for a compelling presentation, and we look forward to the additional research that you're doing as we update this. I'd like to acknowledge two people I just saw log in, and that's our friend Glenn Corbett from John Jay and from the Racers, and also Sally Regenhard, who's a big supporter, and as you can tell from her last name, the tragedy of her son's loss on September 11th has resulted in a positive energy to look at these issues so that we can protect the responders of the future. So thanks for taking the time, Sally and Glenn, to join us. One other acknowledgement here is, as we made reference before, one of the charter members of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent's Healthcare in Danger Initiative, which started about 6 years ago, was pioneered by past President Paul Brennan from the International Association of EMS Chiefs. And thanks for taking the time to join us also, Paul, on this call. We appreciate it. I'd like to ask a question here to be respectful. Oren, I know that you are very busy with everything going on in the city and some legislative. Do you need us to maybe just adjust the schedule for you to go now, or can you still join us and stay with the schedule? All right. Silence means approval. We're gonna pass this off to Daniel Gerard, and thanks again, Dan, for taking the time to join us.
Oh, thank you. It's a great honor, and I'm going to try to do as good a job as Dr. Maguire did. What an outstanding presentation! Thank you very much. I'm going to take the approach here of, what we're seeing in the field and what we're seeing in the profession. I'm going to state right off the bat that I have no conflicts of interest. I don't have a product or a program or anything that I'm trying to sell, and I don't have an investment in any company that does. I'm going to start off by asking if anyone here knows the myth of Sisyphus. And if you do, that's great. And if you don't, just in short, Sisyphus was a guy sort of like Paul. He was very bright, very talented, but he was also a great kidder. And because of this fact that he was a great kidder, when it came time for Sisyphus to pass over to the river Styx, he kind of played a trick where he delayed his passing over. And this made the gods very angry. And so they sentenced Sisyphus to push a rock. And really not a rock, but it was a huge boulder. And he was to push it up Mount Olympus every day. And when he got to the top, the boulder would roll back down to the bottom. And he would have to start all over again. I know for some of us, it probably seems a lot of what we do is, Sisyphusian. These things, play directly into a lot of what we do. When we talk about violence to EMS providers, as chiefs, as leaders, we really have to look at education and training. And when we look at the curriculum for EMTs, when we look at the curriculum for paramedics, we don't spend any real time on the restraint of patients. We don't spend we don't have a practical component in order to assess some psychometric parameter and how you restrain somebody effectively. And conversely with that, we don't spend a lot of time on physical protection. How to recognize danger when you're on the scene. What to do if you're faced with a dangerous situation. How to protect yourself, how to protect your partner. Some of this actually comes about due to on-the-job experience, and some of that can be dreadfully painful. I don't know why this keeps jumping back on me. I'm sorry about that. And so, from a training and education perspective, we're seriously lacking in this regard. There are some nascent movements within the profession where this has come to the fore, and unions have been very active in advocating for this type of training for their members. But universally as a whole, we really don't see this in our profession, and this is something that's seriously lacking. Which brings us into the next issue, which is competence and competencies. And since we don't train members how to protect themselves, we don't train members how to recognize danger, we don't train members how to extricate themselves from dangerous situations, the fact that they lack this basic competence the day they show up at the door is extremely distressing. Think about it like this. We expect every paramedic to be able to place an advanced airway on a patient the day they show up for work. Now, we might have some different tools. We might be using video laryngoscopes, etc. But we expect them to have that basic competence when they come in the door, and then we'll train them to our standard using our equipment. And then when we talk about competencies is the other part of the dynamic, right? A lot of times we use competence and competencies interchangeably, but competency is when you come in the door, you know, you might be the apprentice employee, the new recruit. And then at a certain point, you're going to transition over to being a journeyman. You know, your toolbox is a little more full. You have a little more experience. You have some more training. You have some more education. And then at a certain point, you become a master clinician. Well, we have none of that when we talk about how to protect ourselves and what we need to do, recognizing danger, those subtle clues that we see over a period of time. If we have somebody that's more experienced and they're fortunate enough to be our partner, you know, we might be able to pick their brain and leverage their knowledge. And hopefully we pass down that institutional memory to someone else. But realistically, we have done a poor job in this regard. And, you know, I know that there's a bunch of classes that people can take on their own, verbal judo with de-escalation techniques. This should be part and parcel of the initial education for every EMT and paramedic. And it should be part of the training when they come into your organization. What to recognize, how to protect yourself. You know, I'm glad that Brian brought up personal protective equipment and talked about that and mentioned that, because personal protective equipment has a lot of different issues relevant to us and our profession. You know, I've heard other chiefs say, well, how am I going to afford, you know, like a $700 or $1,000 tactical vest for every staff member? And I would say, look, perform a needs assessment for your organization. Do you need a vest? Do you need the full tactical vest, or do you need something that perhaps is more akin to what a detective or an investigator would wear, that would provide ballistic protection and or stab protection? And there are vests that will fill that parameter. Do your staff members have ready access to vests? You know, you may not want them to wear a vest all the time on every response, but they should have ready access to one in case a situation escalates. And at that point, you know, they need to don their vest and they need to be protected. When I first started in the field, you know, there were a couple of guys that wore vests, but over a period of time, you know, more staff members wore vests. And, you know, me being the old dog around the building, you know, I kind of looked at him and I scratched my head a little bit. But over a period of time, faced with the threats that we were encountering on a regular basis, I worked in a community where the police habitually did not respond to violent crimes. Yeah, EMS was the screening tool in order for them to determine if they needed to send a radio car or not. So looking back on that, you know, the guys that were wearing vests, that were wearing personal protective equipment, were probably the smart ones given the parameters we were operating in our community. Now, your community might be different, but we need to do those needs assessments within our organizations. What do we need? How are we going to provide it? And then obviously the training, etc., how to upkeep your vest. I can't tell you how many guys, had a vest. There was one guy that I remember that he had a tactical vest that he wore, and he had bought it at an Army Navy store. And then when you looked at it, I showed him the expiration date on the vest, and it was like 15 or 20 years, like past the expiration date. And so, those things didn't even occur to him, that, this had an expiration date. And he used to just like toss it in the trunk of his car. And, who knows, carbon monoxide fumes were leaking in there, whatever smells, etc. So who knows if it even would have provided him protection. So even just the basic competencies of use of your equipment and how to leverage it the best way, needs to be incorporated into our training and education for our staff members. I want to talk about operations a little bit, and especially the day-to-day response, intentional violence. Many of the issues that we have seen recently have had to do with members that were attacked on their normal 911 responses in their community. This is extremely distressing. When I first started in the field, so I started in 1981, and I won't hold that back from anybody. I was only 6 years old, but when I started in 1981, it was, to a certain degree, it was unthought of that a member of the general public would raise their hand to a police officer, a firefighter, or an EMT. Not that it wasn't unheard of, but it was a surprising act, more or less. Over a period of time, it became much more common, and it wasn't really an unexpected event. And now we see intentional violence being foisted upon our staff members and our communities. And this is really very distressing, because our mindset when we approach the scene is the scene safe? BSI. We've heard this for time immemorial. In any training class, the student will enter the room, put his hands up, is the scene safe? BSI. But now we can't assume that any 911 scene is safe or doesn't have the potential to escalate. And we see this on a variety of different calls. We don't have to be responding to a shooting or a stabbing or a domestic violence call. We could be responding on a sickness. And we don't know what has happened behind the doors of that home or that apartment prior to our arrival. And our very presence may escalate the scene and result in a violent attack. So this concept that, we've drilled into people's heads time immemorial, is the scene safe? Remember, we have dispatchers that are screening 911 calls, and they are doing the best that they can with the protocols that they have in place. Do we have to change the dynamic? Do we have to ask questions about potential for violence before we respond? Do we have to ask questions for even routine medical calls? Does someone there have, a weapon, a gun, or a knife? That may not be practical, and that may not be realistic. And honest and truly, it may not deter violence from occurring on scene. But intentional violence is part of our everyday nomenclature. It's part of our everyday operations. And so we can't take this for granted. You know, we can't continue to have this mindset. We have to, again, go back to education and training. And we have to instill in people this mindset that any scene can become violent. And this is what you can do to de-escalate the scene, to extricate yourself from danger, and if need be, how to protect yourself. The other thing that we deal with are protests. I've heard from people across the country, the smallest communities, that they have had protests in their communities. They have witnessed violence against police and EMS operators on scene, and they thought that it was something that they would never see before. And I mean, extremely small communities across the United States. This is not something that is limited to large cities. And so, what are the operational dynamics that need to go on? What do we need to tell our members? I remember a couple of years ago, they were during the Occupy protests in Oakland. We were well behind the lines that the police had set up to hold back the protesters. And we had a sergeant from Oakland Police, and he was with us. He was embedded with us. And I said to him, I said, Sarge, I said, are you gonna tell us when it's time to run? And he just laughed and he said, sure, absolutely. And we could see the protest going on a block away, and the line was moving up and down the street. And then all of a sudden, on the cross street where they were protesting on, the crowd just made like this dog leg left turn and came down the street directly toward us. And he just looked at me, he goes, now. The entire protest dynamic, we need to train for, we need to be prepared for, and we need to educate our members and move them off the point of preconceived notions of who they think are friends and who they think are foes. We need to educate our members, you know, what to do when we encounter someone at a protest and they have a weapon. What do we need to do? There are horrific incidences of members of the profession encountering people that were armed, this was unexpected. And by the grace of God, something more egregious did not happen. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is the mental health response. In 1993, Dr. Harishi Najima, Director General of the World Health Organization, made it a point that there would be a huge rise in mental health disorders, especially dementias. Unfortunately, due to COVID, this will probably accelerate that to a greater degree, to a greater proportion of the population. When we see people with mental health disorders and they have the potential to become violent, we have to remember that this is not an enemy combatant. This is a patient. And our response to them and how we encounter them, how we engage them is critically important. There are more than enough anecdotal news reports, case studies from across the United States and around the world that date back to the 20s, the 30s, the 40s and the 50s of patients that were restrained and that died in restraints. And even up until the 60s and 70s, we saw this overall. There was a sea change in how we encountered psychiatric patients and how we worked with them. There was a major change in how we restrained them. Why do I bring this up? Because law enforcement restraint is different than medical restraint. Law enforcement officers can use escalating force up to and including lethal force to restrain somebody with a mental health disorder. And that is not typically their option. That is not what they want to do. But we have seen it in case by case across the United States. As healthcare providers, this is not an option for us. So how we encounter patients that have mental health disorders, how we restrain them, and how we manage them is critically important. What do we do when they have a weapon? There is an increasing change within the community because of political pressures for us to assume this mantle for the mental health response. And so these things need to be quantified. They need to be discussed. We need to talk about what do we do when we encounter someone with a weapon? What is law enforcement's role and where do they fit into the dynamic overall? But we can't wholly discount a law enforcement response for a mental health EMS request if we're going to be tasked with that in our community. And we have to have the tools and the knowledge and the ability to restrain patients safely, because otherwise we are just destined to repeat the same tragedies that we see unfold on the nightly news. So we need education, we need training, we need protocols. And we need to understand if we are going to be tasked with handling patients with mental health disorders in the future, as many organizations are being challenged to do. What does that response look like and who are the members of the team? The last thing that I want to talk about is empowerment. And when I talk about empowerment, I'm talking about how EMS is viewed in the public safety triad. One of the critical issues that we face is that we see that when a law enforcement officer is assaulted, when something happens to a law enforcement officer, that officer, there are legal ramifications for the assault of that officer. Some organizations, some communities have this already, but what we need is a nationwide standard. Okay. In California, I cannot place a mental health patient on a 5150 hold. I have to call a police officer to the scene. If you expect me to accomplish this task, I have to have the same powers and empowerment as the law enforcement officer in order to be effective in my duties. At the same time, I also need the same level of protection so that if I'm assaulted or something happens to me, that person will be prosecuted just as if they had assaulted a law enforcement officer. And when we talk about empowerment, it isn't only for governmental employees. We have to empower the private sector providers as well. We have to give them the same tools and the same protections if they're going to operate in this space and they're expected to perform this function. If we leave them at the door, if we don't provide protections and empowerment for them, then they become essentially the bastard stepchildren of the profession. And that is not good for us overall. I think that's it. Hold on. Did I have anything else here? Oh, and then the last thing that I wanted to say, in regards to Sisyphus, you know, he doesn't realize that at any moment he's permitted to step aside and let the rock hurtle to the bottom and go home. Tragedy is the inertial force of the mind. We can't continue to do the same things over and over and over again. But this is our opportunity to speak up and affect change and do something positive for the profession. Thank you very much. I hope that I didn't run over. Did I, how do I unshare? Did I stop sharing the screen?
Yes, you did.
Okay, great.
So in the schedule, we have a 5-minute short break scheduled in here. So for everyone to kind of stretch their legs, maybe go to the bathroom, get a cup of coffee. So it's 14:06 on the East Coast. So let's say we'll start at, I don't know, quarter after we'll restart and we'll re-queue everyone, okay? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. On the screen is just a collection of some of the issues surrounding this topic that have been covered on a number of different media outlets in the US, in Canada, in the UK. You'll notice it's not just limited to urban areas. You've got Hawaii news stations covering issues. How sad it is, it's not okay to assault paramedics is being written on the back of trucks down in Australia. The UK's making signs and posters. South Africa, ambulances are being hijacked, crews are attacked. Boston had stabbings. You have the fire service being impacted by this. We're going to turn this over to Chief Larry Tan.
Okay, good afternoon. Just real briefly, several years ago, the IAEMSC held a leadership summit in Washington, D.C., and identified that one of the emerging trends that was significantly impacting the EMS community was violence against healthcare providers. Before my retirement, I found myself in a situation where one of the issues that I had to deal with were writing policy on how EMS providers should handle weapons that they encountered during the performance of their job. Not only was there the risk to the providers themselves, but bringing a weapon into a healthcare environment was also risky for the receiving facility. So it took some negotiations and discussions, not only with the providers, but with the receiving facilities on how we would handle weapons that were encountered. And there were more and more circumstances occurring where, in fact, weapons were discovered during the course of paramedics conducting their assessments or their routine job duties and responsibilities. Violence with EMS providers, first of all, is really an issue that deals at the very heart of the provider agency. I mean, think about it. The largest budget item for most EMS agencies are salary and benefits. So it's the personnel that are really the most valuable resource that an organization has. Injury to those personnel or those providers certainly is a cost to the agency in lost time, in workers' compensation costs, as well as in risk to potential loss of the provider. Certainly there is a personal impact to the providers themselves and the potential that you could lose the provider from your service. These types of situations also expose the agency to regulatory issues, civil liability, as well as criminal liability. I mean, if you think about it, a workplace violence issue could very well evolve into an OSHA reportable incident. A provider who is hospitalized could, for a work-related or occupational injury, could very well end up with an OSHA investigation. And certainly OSHA is then going to be looking at what's the policy of the employer, what type of training is taking place with that employer, What type of reporting? And there are some theories that this is truly an underreported incident, that providers themselves will typically underreport events that take place because who wants additional documentation requirements? Who wants to go through a process with an occupational injury? As well as how does the employer review and adjust their policies and procedures to mitigate and make the workplace safer? From a civil liability standpoint, certainly a negligence claim that an employer's failure to provide a safe workplace for the employer could very well result in civil litigation, particularly if there's long-term injuries or potential disability. If you think about it, we know that workplace violence is a foreseeable issue, and did in fact the employer take actions to address that foreseeable issue? For those employers that have collective bargaining agreements in place, most collective bargaining agreements include sections on employee health and safety. So it wouldn't be a far-fetched to think that a union or a collective bargaining group may consider a potential for a contract violation for breach of that contract for failing to maintain proper health and safety of employees. Finally, when you look at the potential criminal liability, part of it is the fact that if indeed you have measures in place within your jurisdiction that will assess criminal penalties, whether they're enhanced or the same penalties as the general public, and I believe Dan Gerard was talking about how you can have enhanced penalties for assault on healthcare providers or EMS providers, similar to those that you see with other public safety professions. In fact, you're seeing healthcare providers in the nursing profession that are also advocating for the same levels of enhanced penalties for assaults on their professions as well. But that also results in additional lost time. The provider that was assaulted is now a material witness to the crime. That certainly during the investigative process, during the preparation for trial, and during the trial and potentially the appeal, they may be obligated to participate in those proceedings, and that's potential lost time. And it also has a psychological effect as they go through the situation over and over again. The other possibility is that you could have barriers to the actual prosecution itself. In looking at a case, a district attorney or a deputy attorney general may be looking and may decide for a number of reasons to go into a plea agreement for a lesser charge, or may decline to actually prosecute the case. And the impact again falls back on the employer and the employee, who now may feel that they are not supported by the system. So this is an issue that has a number of different facets to it. And certainly it would be wise, as was discussed early on, to have a team approach in looking at how does the community handle these types of circumstances? What is the expectations of society for protecting those people that are trying to assist? And do you train? Are you preparing your staff for that? It's interesting in the healthcare field, simulation is being used a lot more for training and preparation of personnel before they actually go into the work environment. And it would be interesting to take a look and see how many EMS provider training programs as a part of scenario-based training are actually incorporating potential workplace violence situations into the curriculum to give people the opportunity to work through and practice and develop muscle memory for these types of situations and put them in a better position. So when they're actually in the field, they're in a better position to have an appropriate response or know how to respond and to potentially mitigate any type of injury. So this is a number of things to take a look at. There's a patchwork. Different states have different types of statutes that protect providers. I would urge all of the participants here to go back and take a look at the criminal statutes that cover their jurisdiction and truly understand what, in fact, is the process for reporting and having investigated and actually prosecuting a case. It may be very worthwhile to have a discussion with local law enforcement as well as the prosecuting attorneys to figure out what exactly would be necessary and what the process would be. And maybe that's a part of continuing education and briefings for the staff so they understand what exactly is going to happen if they're involved in an event that moves on until prosecution. And again, we'd be happy to take any questions at the appropriate time. Contact information, I believe, will be available as well. So thank you very much.
Going to start the video. Thank you. Thank you, Larry. So I got to unmute. Is that you or me? Thank you, Larry. So we'd like to now talk about the transition of issues here. The problems that we see in the streets often translate to problems in how we handle those patients and when we're transferring continuity and patient care to the emergency departments. We've all seen in the last few weeks crazy stories about ambulances being hijacked out of hospital ambulance bays, crews being taken hostage, vehicles being stolen, up to and including weapons discharges in the emergency department. The wildest one I can report that I have documented in the recent time was up in Columbus, Ohio. So I'd like to turn this over to our friend and colleague, Scott Cormier, to kind of start to address some of the violence and the interface with the hospitals themselves. So Scott, take it away.
Thank you very much, Paul. And as I remember my early days in the streets and rivers of Pittsburgh providing care, I think at that time I had an us and them mentality. Us were the EMS workers. And we had some very specific goals: to get to the scene quickly, to adjudicate the call as fast as we could, whether that was talking somebody into a refusal or getting them into an ambulance and getting them to a hospital, or just resolving something so we could get back into service and perhaps eat our breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And it kind of amazed me how we had this us and them when we were as much as part of the healthcare system of that community as the hospitals and the physicians and the other practitioners were. And I think it's even more relevant that after work, when we hung out with our brethren in the emergency room, they told their us and them stories, us of the emergency department, which appeared to be sort of the catch-all for everything in the hospital, and them, all the other departments of the hospital, which seemed to be able to take their time and ease into their shifts and leave people in the ER instead of getting admitted or waiting for diagnostic tests. And as I contemplated this through my career, it turns out that there is no us and them, there's only we providing healthcare services to our communities. And the focus there and the difference there is not subtle at all. As a matter of fact, I've spoken with many of my IAEMSC colleagues and said it may be better if EMS personnel wore scrubs, because it better identifies to us, the EMS personnel, about what our role is, versus wearing tactical pants and shirts and vests and us kind of thinking we're part of the them, which is the public safety organization. And I mention this because healthcare has been rapidly transforming into a patient-centered type of care in our communities versus a hospital-centric care. And so that, to me, is where really EMS and hospital violence collide. Now, I'd like to take just a brief moment to talk about Medxcel, because I think we bring a unique aspect to this conversation. As Paul had mentioned earlier, we're a part of Ascension Health, the largest not-for-profit healthcare system in the country, with a number of hospitals and sites of care across multiple states. That includes ground and air EMS transport services, as well as EMS outreach coordinators. And I bring this up because all this says is we encounter a lot of stuff because of our size, because of the services we offer, everything from academic medical centers to small critical access hospitals. We see a lot of things. As a matter of fact, in this past month, we've had 3 instances at one hospital where EMS patients were brought to our hospitals with weapons. In one case, the weapon was used to hijack the ambulance, where the person stole the ambulance and then later died in a chase. In another one, they held the weapon to the EMS crews at gunpoint until one of our officers was able to de-escalate it. And in the most recent case, it was a weapon that was held in the face of one of our nurses in the emergency department, which we again had to de-escalate. And so if we took an us and them perspective, we'd probably feel okay unless we were the crew that was assaulted, because it was transferred to somebody else. But it's not okay when we as EMS providers bring the violence to our fellow healthcare providers. And so, as I said, we're large. We see a lot of that. We have a lot of former EMS folks working on our team. And so we feel an obligation to share the information that we've learned, both the good things and the bad, so that we can improve how healthcare is administered in our community. I'll mention one more thing about what we do, because I've worked for 2 of the largest healthcare systems in the country. And one of the things I've noticed is when you work for a large organization, whether it's an EMS agency or a government agency or healthcare system, you can tend to get lost. And so when you say things like standardize and optimize, you standardize as much as how many people attended your last quarterly regional meeting. And then once they take that information to their facilities, they change it, or they don't do anything at all, or they do something completely opposite of what you were trying to intend. And we saw that. And so within our organization, every single person that works in safety, emergency management, and environmental care works up through a single chain of command. And so we can not only standardize, optimize, and have integrated communication, but to me, one of the failure points we have in EMS and healthcare is accountability. Who's accountable for that process or procedure or policy or guideline that you have in place? And with the structure we created an accountable organization. So our entry-level safety officer is accountable directly through my chain of command. And I want you to think about that, because as Danny mentioned, if we have policies, processes, and procedures, as Larry mentioned, if we have these agreements in place with our union representatives, how are you going to hold people accountable to it if you don't have the structure to do it? So that's really number one. Have you put somebody in charge of these processes that have the authority and have the reporting requirement to make sure it gets done? Or are you just checking a box? So let's talk about healthcare workplace violence. Healthcare workplace violence occurs 5 times more often than any other industry out there, 5 times more. And it makes sense that it does, because when somebody dials 911 or somebody gets in the car to drive themselves to the hospital, they're already escalating. Nobody has a great time driving to a hospital, even our workers. And so we have to understand that everybody is going to be escalated to some degree when our first interactions occur with them. When you show up on the scene, people are worried. And even if we see it's nothing to get worried about, they don't have that education. And even if you're going because you're taking your mom or dad home from the hospital, you're still concerned and worried about that entire process. And so we deal with people that start off in a very escalated state. The other thing we have to understand is that we've created a culture in EMS and in other components of healthcare that being assaulted is a part of our job. As a matter of fact, in some organizations I've worked with, it was frowned upon to report violence against yourself. And if you worked in the ER or in EMS, it was an expectation. It was a badge almost that you were going to get hit and spit on and swung at, and you just dealt with it and you moved on. And that, I'm sure, has led to a lot of burnout. And people said, you know what, I don't need a job like this. I'm going to move elsewhere. And so Once we have the accountability, we have to look at the culture and we have to change that culture. And that is so hard to do. For example, the culture I try to create is that you palpate the brachial artery before you auscultate a blood pressure, right? How many people still do that? Because we created our own culture and we're not willing to break it. And so how do you break the culture? If you put a workplace violence program in, that it takes somebody 30 to 45 minutes or longer to report the workplace violence incident, they're not going to use it. If they feel like they're going to be grilled about it, then they're not going to do it. As a matter of fact, in some of our hospitals, if we call the local police department to report an assault, the police department will tell us, we're too busy. If you want to report an assault, you have to come down to the station and file a report there. So what other cultures are interacting with our cultures that are preventing us from changing this acceptability of workplace violence? And you saw the pictures that Paul showed, the sad pictures of people riding on the back of an ambulance. It is not acceptable to assault us. As far as serious workplace violence, and serious workplace violence is defined as people having time off work because of the violence, you can see that the violence in healthcare far exceeds everything else. Even with all the shootings we've seen in warehouses and back in the day at postal services and the neighborhood violence that workers get, it far exceeds us. And again, we've created a culture of acceptability. I remember reading a study about 25 years ago that the UK put in a healthcare worker zero tolerance for workplace violence. And at the end of 5 years, workplace violence increased 40%. Now, part of that was people having a mechanism to report it, but the other part of it was that the program failed because they failed to have accountability and they failed to change that culture. As far as these are people that aren't receiving the service that they think they should be receiving, or we're not doing the things that they want us to do. But note that there's 20% of this, 1/5, that aren't patients. And so workplace violence programs need to address the other 20%, including bullying that we see in our ranks, including supervisor relationships as well. And so workplace violence programs can't just focus on the patients, even though they're the majority of what we see. As far as who's receiving the violence, these numbers are just unbelievable. Psychiatric aids obviously 590 per 10,000, but look who's number 2. EMS personnel receive serious violence, right? Violence that causes them to be off work, more than nursing assistants, more than Hey, Paul, did you lose me?
You had me at hello.
All right, I'm going to continue my slides, and we're going to talk about how do we interrupt this process? How do we change the culture? How do we get rid of the us and them mentality? First of all, set an expectation and a vocal expectation that violence is not an expectation of your job. Remember, violence can come from within, and our policies and processes need to address that. And if you hear terms like, that's just the way they are, they've always been that way, don't worry, they're going to retire soon, you're not addressing the problem. Third of all, set expectations. Does your community, do your patients know your policies? And what we're doing in our healthcare systems is we're posting signs that says, hey, we don't accept workplace violence. It's not appropriate. We understand that you're escalating and we want to create a healing environment, but part of that healing environment is keeping our healthcare providers safe. Next, We need to have a patient-centered mentality. It's not about how quickly I can get the call done. As a matter of fact, there should be no time limit to care. If you're running from call to call, and in my experience, in an 8-hour shift, we could have anywhere from 8 to 13 EMS calls, right? So you're constantly running and hopping. But if our excuse of, sorry, shut up, get in the ambulance, I have to get ready for the other call, that's really a failure of our EMS systems. That we don't have the right EMS system in place to take care of our community. There should be no time limit to care. And scene time really doesn't become that important unless you have some sort of illness or injury that dictates that your final treatment it needs to occur at the hospital. And so when it comes to mental health patients, when it comes to calming down a family, scene time really isn't that important other than we take the proper amount of time, whether it's 10, 15, or even 20 minutes to get them to the right place so that they don't escalate and we start that healing process. And again, if the argument is, well, sorry, we can't do that because of the greater good of the community, then you really have to look at your EMS system and what processes and equipment you have in place. Third, de-escalation training. Training practice and regular updates. So two very popular courses in healthcare are MOAB and CPI. I call them back pocket courses. You take the course, you stick it in your back pocket, and maybe you remember how to use it if you need to do that. And then every couple of years, you go through a day or two of training to repeat that again. Those do not help us. So what type of training do we really need that we can do in a short period of time and then have refreshers, whether it's at your weekly stand-ups, whether it's once a month, that says, hey, let's practice this, and let's talk about this process that we have in place and how we come together. Part of that training should be how you not escalate people. In hospitals, we're even looking at doing de-escalation training or recognition of escalation training and how not to escalate to our frontline workers, registration clerks, greeters, facilities, housekeeping people that interact with our patients that could either escalate somebody if they're having a bad day or recognize escalation very early and be able to report it to somebody so we can stop it quickly. So training practice, regular updates, and reaching a broad audience, but not just sending somebody to training every couple of years for a couple of days and thinking that's going to work. Tracking those prone to violence. And so whether we use our 911 systems or better yet, collaborate with our hospitals to find out who's been escalating, even though we may not see it in our ambulances, how do you track that? And then how do you get them the help that you need? If we go to a patient that's hypoglycemic, that's an insulin-dependent diabetic, 5 times in a week, it's not because that person's stupid. It's because they probably need better medical care. So do we just keep going there and dropping in at the ER? Or do we maybe engage their family practice physician and say, hey, we've been to Mrs. Jones's house 5 times for hypoglycemia. And also we notice that her refrigerator is empty. So she's taking insulin and probably not eating. What social services can we get her so that she can be healthier? Again, that's taking the us, them mentality and turning it into a we mentality and how we impact the healthcare of our community. And then finally, remember, violence is a call for help. People get violent because they either have a medical issue or they have a traumatic issue or a psychological issue, and that's a call for help. And we know that, right? We know that in our very, very first EMT classes, that altered level of consciousness means somebody is lacking oxygen, right? They're not oxygenating. And so we have to address that. What are we doing? If our process is, I'm going to tolerate you until you swing at me and then you're going to go to prison, we never address their medical issue. And if you read reports of people in hospitals in their psych wards that become violent, and then we send them to jail and they end up killing themselves or harming themselves. It's the system of us, pre-hospital and hospital providers, failing that patient. And so how do you balance medical care versus arrest? That's something we need to address with our patients, because if we can make our community healthier, we'll see less and less of these mental health issues. And then finally, let's make sure we have a safe environment. We can do this a couple of different ways. Leave the violence behind. Is the patient safe from weapons? We did a study a few years ago of giving metal detection wands to our EMS providers and say, hey, can you scan your patients and just make sure they don't have weapons? And it failed dramatically because EMS did not have an interest in doing it. We didn't provide the proper training for them. We didn't provide a policy or follow-up. And so there's a bunch of these wanded metal detectors sitting out there on a shelf gathering dust. But even further than bringing violence to the hospital, what violence are you potentially bringing into the back of your ambulance? It's not necessarily frisking everybody, and it's not necessarily running everybody through a metal detector. But when you get a homeless person with 5 bags of stuff, what's in the bags? What can harm you? And so as we do our assessment, as we do a head-to-toe survey, what are you doing to ensure that you're safe in that very enclosed area in the back of the ambulance as you transport that patient to the hospital? Also, be prepared for a reaction. What chemical restraints, what physical restraints are you allowed to use? Are you trained to use other than, hey, let's get a couple of sheets or let's get some straps from the backboard? And do you have a clear, accessible path to exit the violence? Sometimes it's best just to walk away. And do you know what that trigger point is? And then remember, even if a patient has a history of violence, you can be caring and careful. I remember somebody we had that had been released from prison for manslaughter. He had some drug issues. He was an insulin-dependent diabetic. And I developed a very good relationship with him. And whenever he got hypoglycemic, they requested that I come. I couldn't do that. I wasn't on duty 24/7. But I let my fellow medics know that, hey, here's this person and here's how you deal with them. And here's how you can make them better. And so we were able to give them the D50 and make them better and get them set up with their primary care physician and create a healing environment, and not just how quickly can we get through this call. You can be caring and careful at the same time. We have to train how to do it. And Dan Gerard mentioned a great point about the lack of training we have about this, but this isn't learning karate, right? This is learning competency-based patient care. Remember that hospitals have a lot of resources for you. We see a lot of patients. We have a lot of specialty departments. We're more than just an emergency department, and you should explore it. We have behavioral health teams. We have threat assessment teams. We have inpatient and outpatient centers. We have training for geriatric, adult, adolescent, and pediatric competencies. We do ligature risk assessments to make sure that people can't harm themselves. And we have access to social services. Those are all things that EMS is just one door knock away, one phone call away to get our resources and truly become a we team. And finally, let's work together and let's not focus on our EMS agency or our healthcare agency. Let's focus on our patients and our community, and let's work together. And Paul, I'm going to turn it over back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Can you release your screen control? Thanks, buddy. So we have some time for questions, and we'll start with one in queue, which is a really loaded one for Dr. Maguire. Brian, do we have a solid data system for reporting EMS injuries that goes across private, third service, fire-based, volunteer? And how important is having that type of data capture? It seems that perhaps law enforcement and fire do a better job of this, but how is this impacting us in the instant, and how is that impacting folks like you that are a researcher trying to keep us ahead of the curve?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is no, we do not have a good data capture system. My sense is that each of the over 20,000 EMS agencies have very specific data and have a ton of data. Even at this point in history with the digital age, it's possible that a lot of that is still in manila folders in warehouses. But even the stuff that's digitized, it's possible we have 20,000 different types of databases. Everybody makes their own at home, and trying to integrate those is very, very difficult. And even within the databases, each person makes up their own database. They're making up their own description. So is an arm injury the same as a wrist injury? So all of those challenges mean that our data capture is poor. And one of the outcomes is that we see that even at the national level. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, does try to capture data by occupation, and they do the best job they can. But one of the unique challenges with EMS is that a proportion of the EMS workforce works for fire departments. And so it's very possible that all of those cases are being categorized as firefighter injuries and fatalities. That doesn't happen at all in Australia. So in Australia, the system is very, very specific to EMS. And so we can see those trends, and we have very reliable data. But we do not yet have reliable data in the United States. And we need reliable data not only for the numerators in terms of what are the cases, the injuries, but we also need reliable data for the denominators. And that is, how many people are working at the agency? What hours are they working? What's the exposure for getting injured? So all of those things are needed.
I mean, it's conflicting, right, Brian? Because you would think that at least OSHA or somebody who captures workplace injuries would at least have an accurate database, but we can't even track how many ambulance accidents there are. I mean, there's check boxes for school buses, but who knows what or how. If we don't have good data, right, we're never going to get past this problem because it's so much complex, and proper and effective solution sets are definitely dependent upon good data sets. So thanks for that answer. The next question that we've got looks like it's going to Chief Tan, and that is should body armor for EMS be a regular part of the provider's PPE given the changing environment that we now operate in?
That's an interesting question, something we actually dealt with in Newcastle County. And you would think that in a suburban with a little bit of an urban county that this wouldn't be as prevalent an issue, but as early as 2006, we actually began issuing soft body armor as a part of a provider's personal protective equipment. Now, having said that, there's also a note of caution, particularly if you're in the collective bargaining agreement, and that is that once you issue the personal protective equipment, now you're going to be faced with an issue of, is it a mandatory part of a PPE ensemble? That is, are you requiring your providers to wear it at all times? That may very well go into a part of the contract referred to as the conditions of work and may require collective bargaining. So I would urge, particularly leadership within EMS agencies, if they're considering this as something, one, you do a risk assessment, and if indeed the threats are there, and if indeed the providers feel that that this is something that they really would feel more comfortable with and something that they want to do, then if you're in a collective bargaining group, to sit down with your representatives from the collective bargaining unit and talk about what should the expectations be, and what are the conditions of work for use of this personal protective equipment. Thank you.
I can just jump in and just share just one other thought on that. And I think that a lot of agencies have implemented the use of vests such as that without a lot of training. And my concern is if it happens without a lot of training, is that EMS personnel may be going into situations that they wouldn't have gone into without the vest. And so I think simply issuing them, if we issue vests, that a lot of training is a necessary part of any change along those lines.
I agree. I don't have a problem functionally with respect to vests, given the environment becoming part of the equipment ensembles. But if they're not properly trained and what the limitations are, understanding situational awareness, we'll be back in the day where you've got people who are combat crawling up to a house with an 80-year-old stroke victim, and then we get upset when they're acting with an altered mental state and they're carrying a free cell flashlight and clock them in the head, and we want to know why we're getting an unusual occurrence report generated out of it. And there's still more that has to be done with this. You know, the data's got to be there, and I hope we get there. We're getting a whole bunch of activity here on questions, so just bear with me.
Hey, Paul, I'd like to add a piece to that as well, which is, as you know, our risk assessment is important. A job hazard analysis is required by OSHA is also important, but sometimes it gets to the question of, would we be better protected by wearing level C PPE on every call as well? And so I think sometimes EMS services will buy vests based upon anecdotal information or because an incident happened, and we can't have a knee-jerk reaction that way. EMS or vests may not be appropriate for all EMS agencies. They may be appropriate for some, but you really need to understand what your risks and vulnerabilities are, because we could be wearing moon suits to be better protected, and you know, we'd probably die of a heart attack before it would protect us from anything.
Well, and I think the fine point on that is also that the agency and the employer needs to have specified policies and procedures that are in place that go about it. Because you know how many times you've seen an event take place and people want to get the elevated personal protective equipment with ballistic vests or stab vests or whatever, and then there's not a policy to enforce it, that if we bought it, you're going to wear it, right? So I mean, those are liability issues, and I can give Chief Tan $1 as my legal retainer and ask him to speak about that. But we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. So this comes from a not so much of a question, I guess, but maybe a compelling comment. At the same time, violence against EMS providers is on the increase. Large discussions across the country about reimagining police are taking place, and that police should not be responding to certain mental health, drug use, and other minor medical calls. Quote, it will be interesting to see how this plays out in the future when EMS continues to respond to certain calls, but maybe without immediate access to law enforcement, because we really know that in many instances, unfortunately, regardless of the intervention, these have a tendency to escalate real fast. Wow, that's a loaded question. And I'll throw that out to anyone on the panel that wants to kind of poke at that. Maybe Dan Gerard can give us a little bit about the 5150 stuff that's taking place, where they're trying to get the legislation through in the county and the city, I believe.
Yeah, so City and County of San Francisco is trying to enable legislation that would allow for them to institute a 5150, the paramedic level provider, to do that. And
just explain, Dan, to everyone, 5150 is a psychiatric hold, because they may not know your California cool kid lingo.
Yeah, so 5150 is a part of the California Public Health Code. And essentially what it does is it allows police officers and mental health professionals to place people on a 72-hour hold so that they could take them even place them in restraints and forcibly remove them to a facility where they can be evaluated for 72 hours. And then at the end of 72 hours, they can extend the 5150 hold. I believe if they appear before a judge and they present compelling reasons, the person is a danger to himself or the community, or they have to let them go. And sometimes the 5150 hold is a very temporary sort of hold. Sometimes they just only have the person in the facility for 8 hours, and then after evaluated, they're determined to be safe. And so the city and county of San Francisco, they've had multiple iterations of this EMS performing homeless intervention for a long, long time, going back to a guy. I know that I'm going to mess up his name, but Niels Tengerlini, who was he had a degree in social work. He was a paramedic, used to work for Department of Public Health, realized that this was a vulnerability in the community, and he was one of the first ones to actively engage people in order to reduce incidents of them going to the emergency department. But it was a very proactive sort of thing. It wasn't that somebody was having a crisis, or there was some type of emergency tied to a patient with a mental health disorder. He was proactively going out searching for patients and trying to meet their needs, food, housing, etc. But San Francisco, they're taking a big bite out of this. They have these behavioral health teams that they're instituting. My community is actually actively looking at that right now, is the introduction of the behavioral health team.
So just hold that for a thought here, because I'm going to throw a curveball.
Sure.
Does anyone want to jump in about some of the crisis and controversy that we've seen emerge with the use of ketamine on IM injections on patients that are acting out, and some of the untoward effects that have occurred because of the pharmaceutical interventions? Brian, Scott, Larry?
Hey, Paul, I wonder, and related to my talk, are we giving them ketamine because we don't have the time to de-escalate them in another manner? Or are we giving the ketamine because we're truly at that need for a chemical restraint to get this person?
I think sequencing is an important issue, but also in some of the jurisdictions we've seen that somehow or another the legislation allowed law enforcement to direct the EMTs or the paramedics on the scene to intervene at that level. And I mean, it's interesting to watch the evolutions and the medical legal debates that are going on with that. But professionally, I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I think that should be a medical decision. I'm not sure that it should be driven at that level. I see Joe popping up there. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Paul, thank you. We've been using ketamine, based on escalation with patients that were unable to de-escalate or restrain if necessary. We have not had an issue with the police directing us. I'm not sure the police were even aware what it, they just see us. Generally, it doesn't happen until our patients are in ambulances. So I agree. I think it's a medical decision. I think because of a couple of instances where there was a poor outcome that, this became much more controversial. I know the Eagles group it pretty much come out against, wholesale removal of ketamine because it does in fact have some use.
It's got great value in the field, right? I mean, it's not just a one-trick pony.
No, I mean, there are obviously like every paramedic and EMT, I mean, there are lots of tools that everybody has in their toolbox. A lot of that resides in their head, and ketamine is just one of those tools that we could utilize. So we haven't seen that issue here. We don't use it a lot, but there are times where it's generally given in the back of the ambulance after law enforcement is either removed from the scene or sitting in a corner just to oversee the safety of our folks. I mean, I think part of the bigger issue here, and when you talk about 5150s and out west, we have Section 12s here. So Section 12 is basically the same the same thing where a police officer, a mental health worker, a social worker can institute the Section 12. But now, unfortunately, in this climate that we see, the police departments are here in Massachusetts, or certainly in the Boston area, have come to the extent where they may not even enforce these Section 12s unless it's very obvious to them that this person's a threat to themselves or to others. Even with a Section 12 in hand, police departments, and I certainly understand it, are very reluctant to go hands-on with any patient unless there's a direct attack. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, even longer than Dan, sadly. But it's certainly society has gotten to the point where we used to walk into shooting calls and calls of violence, and no one ever bothered the ambulance guys. They're like, oh, the ambulance guys are here, and you'd pick up the person, you'd put them on a stretcher, you'd put them in the truck, and no one ever thought to assault our guys. I would venture a guess that 95, if not 100% of our people have been assaulted at work. And then again, that's a level issue where, when you look at injury patterns, that's one way to track it. But I track every restraint daily that gets done in our department. And the amount of assaults, and that's, spitting on people, biting them, attempting to scratch them, taking swings, kicking, that don't result in injury. And I think certainly the point was brought up, and I think it's valid that our people sadly have come to expect this, that it's just part of their role. And it's not. I mean, I think everybody who's worked in this industry has been assaulted at one point or another, but it's unfair that they should expect that.
Joe, I mean, and unfortunately, Boston EMS has had to deal with 2 of your members being brutally assaulted with knives, and
correct.
And it spans rural, suburban, and urban. It's not just limited to one environment.
No, exactly. And that EMT was certainly one of our, I would say, in the general scheme of things, very level-headed, very kind to people, very compassionate. The patient in that particular case was very cooperative. There was no indication. The police were at the scene, but didn't accompany the ambulance because everything was good. And that changed in a second. I mean, she nearly lost her life. Her partner was brutally assaulted. And I think the other piece, as these things move along, is sadly, it'll be 2 years in July.
With Adira.
The perpetrator is still under a hold for her mental health, and there's been no resolution.
Same case with the Bronx incident with Adira,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
The public defenders keep asking for more assessments, and I mean, clearly, he assaulted her. He used the vehicle as a weapon and killed her, and they still have to go to the Bronx courthouses on every other month or something. They try to get the case to move, similar to what's happening with your case in Boston.
Right, and I think that's the frustration level for the field providers. That I mean, we ask the police to file charges, or our people will file charges on a regular basis. And, honestly, once it hits the court system, it's really out of everybody's hand. And like I said, we're approaching 2 years now in that particular case. She's still away, and she's not, she can't harm anybody at this point. But, the frustration is, okay, look, here's one of our own people who was stabbed nearly to death, and nothing's happened. And I think that's a huge frustration, for field providers.
I'll share with everybody that one of the projects that we've done for Medxcel in supporting of Ascension is we're building a medical intelligence program. We're building on the successes that we've seen at places like the Brick and some of the other fusion centers. And we're drawing information, and some of these threats, direct and indirect, are emerging against locations and providers in EMS and elsewhere through the internet. And tracking and stalking associates and whatever. So this is another way that we need to kind of, from an EMS perspective, start to look and see how is the disruption of operations to our EMS systems, and what are the true threats to our individuals, whether they're working in the dispatch center or they're out on the street or their bosses, because it's a real changing environment. And I'm not trying to be, alarmist here, but if you snooze, you lose, right? That's what they say in Brooklyn. Things are changing. If we're not ahead of it, it's going to be a real problem. We've got about another, I don't know, 3 or 4 more minutes. So let's see what other questions that we have here that we can go to. Okay, here's some. Scott, Brian, Danny, Larry, or anyone that's on the phone, because apparently it's pretty cool. We can open this up to anyone. Anyone have any thoughts on awareness and implementation of the NFPA 3000 that's looming?
Hey, Paul, I represent IAEMSC on NFPA 3000. Thank you for that opportunity. NFPA 3000 is very specific to active shooter and hostile events. What we're talking about here is workplace violence. And so it's really up to your localities to adopt NFPA 3000. We'd like to see that done. It gives training standards and it gives minimum equipment standards to responding to those events. But some other things that are happening, and this started at the end of President Obama's administration, where he tried to promulgate regulations through the Department of Labor for specific healthcare worker workplace violence requirements. And it dropped off the vine. It was at the end of his administration. Some states like Illinois have passed those. And whenever the legislators think about healthcare, that potentially could include EMS. And so that, I think, is something that needs to be looked at, which is what standards are our employers, what standards are our industry being held for these workplace violence events?
Okay. Well, looks like we're getting close to wrapping up here. I'd like to thank we had some international participants here. I'd like to thank our peers from Canada that logged in on this also. And let's go once around. Let's start with Brian Maguire for any closing comments, and then we'll wrap this up. Brian, do you have anything you'd like to end up with?
Great, thanks. Fascinating discussion. I'm glad we covered a lot of areas. I think that one of the things we need to keep reminding ourselves is the involvement of multiple groups in this. So there's an example from Canada of implementing everybody had to be prosecuted, no exception policy. If an EMS person was assaulted, the perpetrator had to be prosecuted. And that seems, on one hand, the first brush seems like, oh, that makes sense. But the EMS people were saying, no, I got this little old lady. She's hypoglycemic. I don't want to prosecute her. So we need to have a holistic approach to this and be involved, have our personnel involved in decision-making as we go through any of these preventive strategies. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. And let's go to Chief Gerard. Dan, do you have any closing comments or pitches for the association and how they can get more information, like the position statement and paper that you guys put out?
Well, we're getting ready to issue a white paper on this very topic. The thing that I would say is that if you look at all the endemic elements that we touched upon here, from Brian mentioning the fact that we that there's a lack of data, all the way to Scott's presentation regarding integration into the healthcare system and how we're viewed in the overall picture here. Each one of these topics that everyone has touched upon could be a presentation in itself, and could be an entire day of roundtable.
Hey, just be careful, because Dr. Jennings might try to recruit us for more of those sessions. Okay, so watch what you wish for.
Well, listen, just the legal stuff that Larry's talking about, that could be a week's worth of presentations, because you're going to have city managers there, you're going to have corporate councils, there's, the depth and breadth of that just kind of explodes my head. Realistically, overall, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to take a critical look at ourselves and our organizations here. We have some good starting points that we need to get our arms around, and we need to grasp, and we need to move forward. And we can't say that we're going to leave it for the next guy, because as we've seen over a period of time, this hasn't gone away. It's gotten worse. And so, we need to act in a progressive, forward manner. And we need to advance this within the profession.
And I think, and Scott might be able to jump in here, but I think that there was a collaboration with ASPR and the Healthcare Preparedness Program on a violence in healthcare document that we were a co-sponsor, co-author on, that they can go up on the website to get. I think it's still up there. I don't know, Scott, do you want to speak to the issues and your comments?
Yeah, there's a number of resources about violence on the ASPR Tracie, TRACIE website. If you're still Googling for stuff about patient care and emergency management, you need to ungoogle and go to Tracie. You're right, Paul. We're having these conversations all the time. And the stance really centers around three things. Patient-centered care from a community perspective. So what role does EMS play in that? Second thing is changing the culture. That starts with each of us. We can't wait for somebody else to do it. And the third thing is what Dan mentioned, which is use this as a platform to start a conversation and start more conversations. And as I said, on any given Sunday, you fight for an inch. And those conversations are going to get you inches. And it'll take a lot of inches to get you to a point where people are going to start to take action, but don't give up.
Let's hand this off. Larry Tan, any final comments?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of interest in this particular topic, and rightly so. As I said, with the EMS professionals that we're dealing with being the most valuable asset for any EMS organization, protecting them is certainly in the best interest of both the system, the organization, and the public as a whole. I would urge all the participants to leverage professional associations such as the International Association of EMS Chiefs as a platform for sharing experience and solutions amongst all of the organizations and looking for ways that we can reduce the risk to the providers. Finally, I'd just like to thank everyone for their time, for the panel, certainly for sharing their experience, and the participants for joining us today. Thank you.
All right, so before we turn this back over to Dr. Jennings, Sally, you want to say anything here? I see you on here, and thank you for taking the time to join us. Okay. There you go. So as we close up here, before we turn it over to Dr. Jennings here, I'd like to thank everyone for your continued support and participation, not only for today, but for your continued support for the work that Racers is doing. It's a great organization to kind of support and advance what we're doing. Special thanks to all the speakers that came in to kind of lend their assistance and hands with this. There's references and resources on a variety of sources. Tracie is one at ASPR, the International Association EMS website, as well as Racers. Dr. Jennings will share with you how this is going to be mounted up there for future access and referencing, and we'll be putting some position statements and supporting references up there for that. And lastly, if anyone's a paramedic who's looking for a career transition, those skills are transportable. You can always go up to Medxcel.com and take a look. We're always looking for experienced medics who have an interest in healthcare emergency management and safety issues. So thank you for your time. And Dr. Jennings, we'll turn it over to you for any last closing comments.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic talk, and I'm really delighted. It's been a tremendous panel. I don't think we could do any really more comprehensive look, kind of snapshot of exactly where we are nationally. And so I thank you for that. I want to extend our appreciation to the IAEMSC, the International Association of EMS Chiefs, for graciously co-sponsoring this. And as Paul indicated, this is not a one-off. We're hopefully going to be continuing to develop resources in this area. And this is a subject that is really kind of custom built for the Regenhard Center, in that it involves multiple disciplines working together. So thank you to our panelists, Brian Maguire, Daniel Gerard, Scott Cormier, Oren Barzilay, who hopefully will have some good news out of Albany, and Larry Tan, and of course to Paul Maniscalco, who served as our moderator today and helped put this thing together and did such a great job. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, there's our webpage, christianregenhardcenter.org. You can join our email listserv by clicking on contact and then join now. We do not inundate you with a lot of email, but that is one good way to find out about our information. And lastly, we do have a Twitter feed which publicizes all of our events, and that's at @RacersJJC. So I appreciate everybody's attendance today, and thank you once again to our panel. And we will update you via email when this video is available. It will be available on the Regenhard Center webpage, and when we get that resource page together, we will also notify you of that as well. So thank you all for attending, and we appreciate your support.